Shalom, everyone. The peace of Yahweh be with each and every single one of you, and welcome to another episode of Seeds of the Witness. So, if you can remember, up until now, we have been covering the life of the great prophet Yeremiah and following the exhortation of one of the apostles to look to the prophets as examples. We were examining a lot of the things that he was faced with as a teacher who had been brought, who had been trained, who had been raised up during a time period when the children of Israel were being taken backwards into the ways of the fallaway Cushites and the fallaway Egyptians, and were being maneuvered and manipulated, and some just consciously themselves and not having to be convinced to forget Yahweh, as was pointed out to the people and the writings of the great prophet Yeremiah somewhere around about chapter 23. Like there was a deliberate plot to cause the people to forget Yahweh, to forget, to turn away from it, to change the things that had been given to them through the great prophet Moshe. Is what it really boiled down to, forgetting the things that Moshe had taught them, which were really things that Yahweh had given to them through Moshe. Because of course he tells us, we see in other areas where he speaks about the prophets and how he operates with them, that it's his words that he puts in their mouth, that they then have a responsibility, regardless as to what they might face, to deliver over to other people. Sometimes just the congregation in general, in other instances directly at kings and princes, and in other instances directly at and for the benefit of people in office of priesthood and so on and so forth. So we wanted to continue to delve into his life for all of the knowledge and the wisdom that and the understanding that it has in helping bring things together. And that's what an understanding is, if you can recall. It's a bringing together of the pieces, here a little and there a little, throughout the scriptures in the mind. And that is an understanding. We wanted to continue today to delve into his life and his experiences, just as we've been exhorted to help us to understand things today. Because if you remember, that's exactly what one of the other prophets wasn't a priest, but he was a prophet, Daniel, what he spoke of concerning this time period, where it says there'll be those with understanding. There'll be those who will be able to bring together all of these pieces and have the correct mind frame and perception with regard to events. And of course, that by that, they will be not only a benefit to themselves, but they will also be a benefit to others. It will be the impact and effect of that. So that's what we're doing today. I wanted to pick up just to look a little bit more deeply into the climate that he was having to work in and what was going on, with the Benjaminites, the grievous wolves of that time period. And once more, it's no coincidence that he was raised up, not magically, but he was trained. Yahweh already knowing what was going to take place before they were even born, and began doing what they were allowed to do. And working and operating to sabotage and to undermine and to destroy the work of the great prophet, the faithful one, the great prophet Moshe. Yeremiah was already being brought up and was already being trained up. And at a particular point, he began to take on his responsibilities as a teacher right in the midst of his brothers. He wasn't a priest. They were all in the house of Yahweh, as we'll get into. He wasn't a priest, but he was an inspired teacher of Yahweh, who at a certain point began to come forth and to perform, his office, which involved pointing out things to everyone, but definitely to people also in positions of very great power, and with the consequence, with the result anyway, that ultimately, it ended up costing him his life, but he was forewarned of all of that, and that's a whole bunch of preface. But let's just get a little bit more into it, the things that he was having to deal with. I wanted to pick up on chapter 35, continuing to look at the life of the great prophet Yeremiah. And they called him Jeremiah, but once more, we know there was no J in the Hebrew language, so what was his name? A person can get a Strong's Concordance, and you can see pretty easily that the Creator's name was compounded with a lot of the names of people in Scripture, particularly the prophets, and you can get to Yeremiah pretty easily, with just that information. But all right, let's go to chapter 35. And this is more of what the great prophet Yeremiah was dealing with. It says, "This is the word which came to Jeremiah from Yahweh in the days of Yahakim, son of Josiah, the king of Yah." So once again, he was alive and he was operating and functioning during the time of the kings, which is they had gotten it to that point. Those who you have to question whether or not there wasn't a large contingent of people who came out among the children of Israel with the direct intention of sabotaging everything that Moshe was trying to accomplish, especially when we get out of the mindset of everything being all primitive and backwards. Before this time period, like we represent the height of humanity and the height of civilization in this time period, when actually it's the exact opposite. We were at our height to start, and we've been declining ever since then. But certain advancements with regard to you want to say advancements, but the manifestation, the arrival of certain technological things have a tendency to present an opposite kind of thinking with regard to it all, but same governments that we see in the world today, and all of its maneuverings and all of its intentions and people involved in it that have ideas, often opposing the ideas of other people and definitely opposing Yahweh, and who have power to go along with that opposition. So if you think about all of that and them coming out of an entire governmental system and we're talking about millions of people getting ready to go into another land potentially and establish another political entity. Think about what would take place if somebody tried something like that today. You have examples of people like Applegate and all of that kind of thing that immediately comes to mind. But just all of that for context sake with regard to the people who came out of Egypt. It wasn't everybody that was even sincere about leaving Egypt with the idea of even trying to establish something in Yahweh. There were definitely people who came out with bad intentions. And so you have that going on too. So the great prophet Jeremiah is raised up in the midst of all of this, when Moshe has gone to sleep, and they've made some significant headway. They've gotten the judges. They changed the governmental system in operation from the judges, who were in many cases very strong teachers in Yahweh, and they shifted it over to the kings. Now, it's not like a king is a bad thing. The king isn't. Kings should be wise, righteous, and wise administrators, like we saw in Solomon, of public affairs. There's nothing wrong with that. The law even speaks about that. The king just has to be of Yahweh. But whether or not they had grown to the point to where that was a needed and necessary thing, and it came about or organically, is the question here. And it did not. They had some things, and they were demanding for a king outside of somebody that Yahweh had chosen. They were looking for somebody to fight for them. They wanted to go back to the way of warmongering, nation against nation and religion against religion kind of thing. And so in the midst of all of this, though, this is where and their successes, allowed successes, here goes the great prophet Jeremiah, so that they can never be able to say that they weren't given a warning, at least. So bunch of time in preface. It says, "This is the word which came to Jeremiah from Yahweh in the days of Yahakim, son of Josiah, the king of Yah." So he's operating once again in the days of the kings. It says, "Go to the house of the Rechabites and speak with them, then bring them into the house of Yahweh." This is another thing that, in reading this, a lot of people might miss. That all of these events that we see recorded in Scripture, from murders, all kinds of atrocities, these things were taking place within the house of Yahweh. For the sake of cosmeticizing things, or avoiding difficult and hard questions, or acknowledging hard realities, it could be easy to make light of that and to just overlook that. But from the first recorded murder that we have, which was carried out by a priest of Yahweh, he was an unrighteous priest, but by a priest of Yahweh who launched a war against and murdered his own brother, who was a righteous priest. All of that took place in the house of Yahweh. The prophets were murdered by people of Yahweh, people in the house of Yahweh, right? All of this, from once again, from a comparative standpoint, even in the last days, you have scriptures that speak about the wheat and the tares, the wise and the foolish, and what comes forth from fools. And that's the reality of what takes place, is allowed to take place in order to prove certain things and in order to place certain things within certain individuals, that they would have certain experiences and the ability to respond to them, and that made a part of their eternal character. All of these things are allowed to take place in Yahweh's house at this time. From the beginning, they have been allowed. So, just that, to put a realistic perspective on the idea that everything is all hunky-dory and rosy and that's no. There's been murders and all kinds of things from the time of the beginning. And there's scriptures that prophesy about brother betraying brother to death, even in this time period. And that's the reality of what's allowed to take place among Yahweh's people right now, in this time period. But okay, so go to the house of the Rechabites and speak with them, then bring them into the house of Yahweh, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. So I went to get Yazaniah, the son of Jeremiah, son of Habazeniah, and his brothers, and all of his sons, the whole house of the Rechabites, and brought them into the house of Yahweh, into the room of the sons of Hanan, son of Gedaliah, the man of Yahweh, which was next to the room of the officials, above the room of Messiah, son of Shulam, the keeper of the door. Then I placed the pitchers of wine. And cups before the sons of the house of Rechab. And I said to them, drink some wine. But they said, we will drink no wine, because Yonadab, son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, you must drink no wine, you nor your sons forever. You must not build a house, sow seed, plant a vineyard, nor possess them, but all your days you must live in tents, so that you may live many days in the land where you are sojourners. And that bears a little bit of a light explanation, because it's not like they were just doing that for no reason whatsoever. Like nomadic and just deciding to live an ascetic life. Because they believed that having gardens and all of these kinds of things and even drinking wine, that it was evil. That wasn't what was taking place. The Rechabites, as borne out, if a person is aware of their presence in Scripture, it doesn't speak tons about it, but it does give information concerning them in Scripture. And there is some historical information available with regard to them at all. The thing is, they were volunteer workers in the house of Yahweh. They were brought into the house of Yahweh, so they were a part of the house of Yahweh. They were dedicated workers, volunteer workers in the house of Yahweh. And so essentially what we have with this command that's given to them by their father, Yonadab, was designed to keep them focused. Drinking wine and all of that stuff and merrymaking, like was spoken of later in the teachings of other prophets and other teachers, he basically got that out of their way. Don't get wrapped up in any drinking, and don't get caught up in trying to pursue the riches of the world. Don't be after self-enrichment and trying to build empires and stuff. Keep your mind focused on the assignment, the job, the privilege, and Yahweh's work that he has allowed to you. And this is how you do it. Stay away from the drinking and don't be concerned with building riches for yourself. So that's what was taking place. Many of them were copyists. But they might have had other responsibilities to go along with it as well. But all of that for preface. That's why the instruction was given to them by Yonadab. It was to keep them focused. It was to keep them from falling into everything that was taking place among the children of Israel at that time, where they were falling back into the ways of Cush, the fallaway Cushites anyway, the Cushites that ultimately created the tree of righteousness and evil, and were practicing things that were not given to mankind originally. And that's where mankind did start originally, is in Cush, in Africa. But that's what it was designed to do. It was to keep them on the straight and narrow, to keep them focused, is why that instruction was given to them. Just to say that, because otherwise, it just seems like they were once more just the kind of people who just were of the opinion that you couldn't do anything to enjoy life, and you shouldn't try to have any possessions and all of that kind of stuff. From a meaningless standpoint, it's almost mystical and all of that kind of thing. Like people who just got some enjoyment out of being as severely disciplined as they possibly could. And that's not what was going on. You know, they were workers, and Yonadab was trying to keep them focused, is why he gave them those instructions. And there's a reward for it, as we'll see later. We can never get to it. But okay, so it says, and so we have obeyed the voice of Yonadab, son of Rechab, our father, in that he charged us, and all that he charged us, we haven't changed anything, to drink no wine all our days, we, our wives, our sons, or our daughters, nor to build houses for ourselves to live in, nor do we have vineyards and field and seeds, crops that come forth from and sell them and selling them and making us some money or making us a bag. We aren't wrapped up in any of that. But we have lived in tents. We have our dwellings and we're content, and have obeyed and performed all that Yonadab our father commanded us to do. Even though he went to sleep, they were still remaining faithful in it. And it says it was only when Nebuchadnezzar, who was also Hebrew, a far-away Hebrew, you get that also from the book of Daniel, where you only have known of all of the families of the earth. The name of Nebuchadnezzar itself is even a Hebrew name. But he was one of those warmongering kings, and that's what they had lapsed into, divided and little kingdoms and fighting against one another, prevailing through strength, through military might and strength. And so here comes Nebuchadnezzar rampaging through the land, and he says, it was only when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land that we said, come, let us go to Jerusalem to escape the Chaldean and Iranian armies. That is why we are living in Jerusalem. Otherwise, we'd still be exactly where it was that our father left us when he went to sleep, doing exactly what he told us to do, assigned us to do, and exactly the manner that he told us to do it. Not drinking any wine, not having our minds on riches, focusing on copying the scriptures for those who would come later, among other things. The only reason we left or are functioning in any capacity different from the way that it was when our father Yonadab set it up was because this man and his warmongering caused us to have to make decisions, But then it says, then the word of Yahweh came to Uriah, saying, this is what Yahweh of hosts, the father of Israel, says, go and tell the men of Yah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you never receive instruction and listen to my words, which of course was coming forth from the prophets, as we read earlier. I'll raise up a prophet, I'll put my words in his mouth, and him you have to listen to. Will you ever listen to the teachers? But if you remember, and Uriah was also told they're going to fight against you. So is that, will you ever stop fighting with them, fighting with the teachers, and listen to them instead? Because ultimately Yahweh is just trying to help people. The man is just an instrument. He's speaking because Yahweh has moved him to speak and has given him the words to speak, has basically mandated. He's going to do it. Like the great teacher told us before, some things are a lie, but when Yahweh has something in his plan that you're going to do, you're going to do it. If you got to get swallowed by something in order to wake you up, you're going to do it. He's just speaking what he must. If you remember the great apostle Shaul, he's like, man, woe is me if I don't, So all of that, will you ever listen to them? The instruction that Yonadab, son of Rechab, gave to his sons never to drink wine or perform, for to this day, even though he's dead and even though he's gone, for to this day they drink none and are obedient to their father's commandment. But I have spoken to you rising early and speaking to you, yet you have not obeyed. Right? So for the sake of time, let's see if we can go down to verse 17. It says, therefore, this is what Yahweh Almighty of hosts, the Father of Israel, says, behold, I will bring on Yahweh and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem all the disaster that I pronounced against them. Not true. They were bringing it upon them. They were bringing all the evil upon themselves through their conduct and choices. If you look just a little bit up earlier, that word disaster there is the same word as evil. And if you look up there in verse 15, it tells you that they were turning to evil. So it was them bringing the evil upon them. Yet it wasn't like Yahweh is some egomaniac once more that is upset because people aren't feeding his narcissistic, appetite by doing any and everything he wants for them to do, and he's going to penalize them for it. It's not that kind of thing. People were incurring penalty upon themselves by making certain choices that are just a matter of cause and effect. uh, pivoting off of the way that the universe is designed. There's laws that govern it, with positive things that take place when everything is in sync with it, and consequences that occur built into the system. And the system has to be built this way in order for it to be eternal. But when somebody does something that goes against those principles, and goes against those rules that are needed for it to function in a healthy and an eternal way, then they bring consequences upon themselves for it, just based on the effects of it. You jump off of a building, you don't have the ability to defy gravity, you hit the ground, goes flat, and it's just how it is. But gravity is a needed thing in order to keep things on the surface, to keep things on the ground. It's the reason why you don't build a building one day, come outside the next day, it's gone. You look around and see it floating up in the air somewhere. So gravity is a needed thing. And if a person chooses not to acknowledge the realities that go along with the law of gravity, so that they walk off a building that's 100 stories tall, well, then the consequence of them being pulled down to the ground, the same place where things are placed stationary, is something that they brought on themselves, with lethal consequence, with lethal effect in many cases. But okay, so all of that. But it says here, therefore, this is what Yahweh Almighty of hosts, the Father of Israel, says: Behold, I will bring on Yah and all of the inhabitants, they're going to bring on themselves the disaster pronounced against them. For I have spoken to them, but they have not listened. I have called to them, but they have not answered. All of this is done through his teachers. But to the house of the Rechabites, Urania said, this is what Yahweh of hosts, the Father of Israel, says: because you have obeyed the commandment of Yahweh your Father, even though he sleeps. Even though he sleeps. And this program is named the seeds of the witness. And seed is another way of saying child. A child either by birth or a child by tutelage. Either way. There are those who have a spiritual father even today. But it says, because you have obeyed the commandment of Yahweh your Father, even though he rests, not taking advantage of that, that wasn't. He did that for a time, but there's nothing in the law that says a person can't have a sip of wine. In fact, a sip of wine, the scripture says, is great for the stomach's sake, in addition to other tons of things that a person could take. Why not have something like clabber milk instead and be obedient? But not making excuses like that. Well, the law says the wine is perfectly fine. Let's create something where we'll do it on the Sabbath. It could be against, having a little bit of wine on the Sabbath. It's a Sabbath tradition. It's done to celebrate the Sabbath. And then, of course, it might get away. Eventually, it does get away from just having it on the Sabbath now that it's been reintroduced. And now that we're having wine, but not a little bit of beer. Once you got wine and beer going, what's to stop anybody from having some strong drink? And there we go, all over again. Not doing anything like that. Now that Yonadab has went to sleep. Now that Yonadab is resting. But they remain faithful and loyal, is what Yahweh is saying. And kept all of his precepts, all of them. Haven't changed anything. And performed all that he commanded you. Therefore, this is what Yahweh of hosts, the Father of Israel, says: Yonadab, son of Rechab, will never lack a man to stand before me forever. Speaking once again about the great prophet Daniel, spoken of in a lot of different places, but when the great prophet Daniel speaks of the kingdom of priests that will never be destroyed, it will go on forever. Yahweh will not forget your labor of love, nor that principle, that quality that he values so much, the loyalty and faithfulness that you've shown to Yonadab, who was just teaching you to be loyal and faithful to me. When I establish my kingdom, the reward is that you all will be there. You will be there for the faithfulness and the loyalty that you've shown. So all of that for the environment that the great prophet Yeremiah was functioning in, and with a lot of opposition, even though it was obvious that the man was a teacher sent by Yahweh, there were people who were, despite that, at least publicly, rejecting the man, not embracing the idea that he was a teacher, and saying that he had made himself a prophet and all of this kind of stuff. And these were people who had power, and so in many cases they were able to have their way in the minds of the people because of it. Not the righteous, as we can see right here. Even though he wasn't a priest, the Rechabites did exactly what he told them to do. They came to the house of Yahweh like he told them to. But even though they respected him as being a prophet, you also notice there that when he told them to do something that they knew wasn't right, that went against what had been left to them by their father, they told the prophet, "No, we're not going to do that." Even though they had great respect for him, obviously there's a bunch of people that you remember could have went to at that time. I imagine who he had asked them to do something, they looked at him up and down, like, who are you? You aren't this or you aren't that. But these righteous ones, they definitely acknowledged it, because in the law there's both. There's a respect for people who have every office, but there's a respect for the priest, but then there's also a respect for the teacher. And the Rechabites, I imagine had the law and practice in the life with respect to both and with respect to all. But just that's a point to acknowledge too. And they weren't corrected for that. Like the great prophet Jeremiah told you to drink it, and you guys didn't do it. And so this is the consequence that's going to come upon you. They were commended. They were commended for it. They should not have. And they didn't. They told them no, But that's not what our father Yahweh, that's not what our father you think in your mind, but with those of us who are striving to be faithful today, that's not what our father Israel laid down. But okay, so there's a reward for that. But they were rejecting him because of that, because he had the courage to bring forth those kinds of things. But as we were covering before, the authenticity, the truthfulness of a person with regard to whether or not they are or aren't sent from Father Yahweh is reflected in large part by whether or not the things that they teach, whether or not the things that they prophesy concerning actually come to pass, right? The scripture says, remember we were looking before, and one thing that's evidence of the fact that they aren't sent from Yahweh is if the things that they're talking about don't. If it never materializes, that's not someone, Yahweh doesn't play games, it's not someone sent from Father Yahweh. But then in the opposite, if it does, then that's evidence of the fact that they are, So we've been looking at the prophecies that were given to the great prophet Jeremiah, despite people talking about, in his time period that he was not a prophet actually sent from Yahweh, that bear out the fact that he was. When you see these things coming to pass, I'll tell you about it beforehand, so when you see these things coming to pass, so we were looking specifically at some of his prophecies that apply to things even today. We were looking at, if you remember, Jeremiah chapter 49, where we're speaking about Elam, which is actually just Aram. And that's what we see taking place, in the news now. And if you remember, we'll read it again in chapter 49 and verse, let's start at 35. It says, "This is what Yahweh of hosts says, Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the principal support of their might." Remember, we looked that up. I believe it's Julius First. Other lexicons as well, but Julius First tells us that Elam is just Aram. It's the Persians, the Iranians. But it says, "I will bring the four winds against Elam," or the four winds against Aram, "from the four corners of heaven. I will scatter them to all these winds, so that there will not be a nation to which the outcast of Elam or Aram will not go." Okay, so in order to understand that, we're speaking about bringing the four winds against Aram, or four winds against Elam. A person has to turn to the book of Revelations. Bearing in mind everything that we just read there about the four winds, in order to understand what it's talking about there. And that's, once again, that's an understanding, points coming together in the mind that help a person to understand what's being spoken of when Father Yahweh inspires a teacher to teach concerning a particular thing, provided that information is allowed to be understood during that time period. But now, so here in chapter 7, just starting out, remember the four. "And after these things I saw four Malachim standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, so that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree." So that's what we're talking about when we look here and speaking about in verse 36, "I will bring the four winds against Elam from the four corners of heaven." And speaking about these winds here that are being held back by four Malachim. Right? A person could look into that word there, the winds, and even the idea of of blowing. And you can see what's being held back is violence. What's being held back is destruction. The same destruction that's being spoken of in the book of Jeremiah. And this is what it's being held away from. The nation of Elam, the nation of Iran, not only them, but they're leading the groups that are ultimately going to be targeted in order for certain people to have their way, right? And we'll get into that in just a moment now. But let's see. To help further our understanding concerning that one, let's look over to chapter 9. We're speaking about these four again. We're holding back these winds of war that are ultimately going to be unleashed on Elam, or unleashed on Iran, and not just Iran, but also their allies. All of the people who are in line with them, all of the people that are joined with them. And is going to translate into a great slaughter, as is shown here in this chapter, in chapter 9, where a third part of the people over that area of the Euphrates, that fourth part of the earth, are going to be destroyed. Now that's a whole bunch of scriptures together in just one without us looking at the scriptures first, but that's really what it boils down to. So looking here, and bear in mind that as the great apostle said, Yahweh in different times and in different ways spoke to our fathers. So, even with the witness, he's referred to as the witness, but in other cases, like by the psalmist, by the great prophet and the great King David, he's referred to as a branch. Moshe also referred to him as a branch. And Jeremiah also referred to him as a branch, but in other cases, he's referred to as Zerubbabel. In other cases, we're in the book of Revelations right now, the great prophet Yachanan refers to him as a trumpeter, all speaking about the same person, and each time a different element is introduced, giving another measure of information, another measure of knowledge with regard to that individual, who he is, and the things that he will be doing, right? Same thing here. So you have the four, and they're often referred to as the messengers, but along with that messenger, sometimes you'll see angels, which just means messenger. Sometimes they're referred to as craftsmen, sometimes they're referred to as horses, and other times they're referred to as horns. And in each case, giving information about those four, but it's nonetheless those four that it's speaking about. Those four, of course, are the quartet. For more information concerning that, a person can get the birth of the nuclear baby that goes into details regarding it. It's surfaced, just like we're getting ready to read here, in that Euphrates region to accomplish certain things, and it is the United States of America, the United Nations, the EU, and Russia, all together in a shaky alliance, a house divided, so fighting against each other. The system now is all about competition, and so they are in competition, which is just war among one another. But as much as there are alliances amongst men, they are together in an alliance, those four, and that's what it's speaking about, the quartet. But it says, and the last Malach, or the sixth Malach sounded, and I heard the voice of the four horns of the golden altar, which is before Yahweh, saying to the Malach, which had the trumpet, loose the four angels who are bound in the great river Euphrates. The same four angels that we're talking about here in Revelation chapter 7. And I saw these four Malachim, which is, once again, just what they call, angels or messengers, standing on the four corners of the earth, holding back these winds that are spoken of, that will be unleashed on, that will be brought against Elam or Iran, just like we see playing out in the news today. Principally, the United States of America, who is of the quartet, that is against them, and working to out front further its intentions of, as we'll see here in just a moment, moving boundaries to the Euphrates. A boundary to the Euphrates is really what it's talking about when a person understands this particular scripture, where it says they are bound in, true to a certain extent. That particular article, in their activities are bound. They can't go any further than what Yahweh allows. And so they are bound and restricted in their efforts and intentions to redefine, to reshape things, this new order that they have in mind. They're bound in a very concrete and significant way just in that region where we see their efforts taking place now. but it's also for. It can be translated for, and they were bound for, that region to start out. That's where everything starts. But along with that, it is also that they are bound in their intention, like they've intended in their minds to move the boundaries of a certain nation to the Euphrates, which is the catalyst, the motivation, and everything that's behind what we see moving in the Middle East right now. And all of this lends credence and helps us to understand more deeply what the great prophet Yeremiah was talking about when he was saying Elam or Iran is going to be destroyed. What's taking place during that time period that's going to come about is what we're speaking about now, where you have these four in operation, really one running out front, and them competing and fighting against each other, because even Russia is there trying to get its little piece of the pie and so forth. You have these four, but principally America, who has its plan to move the boundaries of a nation all the way over to the Euphrates. And for those who are aware of it, that's the Greater Israel Project. I'm glad to hear now that some are on board actually with that particular teaching, which is given in Scripture, was brought forth by the last days anointed witness Israel Abel Hawkins, that the boundaries of Israel will be far extended over to the great river Euphrates, and that information was also covered in detail with the articles on the Greater Israel Project in the third volume of the Book of Yahweh, which hopefully is still in the house of Yahweh at this particular point in time, though only limited to certain people in terms of being able to access and peruse it. But that information was covered in very great detail there. The Greater Israel Project, which is to move the boundaries of Israel to the river Euphrates, and as far back as the beginning, which is the Nile. From the Nile to the Euphrates, or from the river to the sea, is what they're calling it. And we'll get into some articles on that hopefully in just a moment. But that's what this is speaking of, this intention by the quartet to reshape the Middle East in the last days, in this time period, a part of which, starting in the Middle East, just like Kissinger said, and that's a very great point to acknowledge also in all of this. Even though if a person was to look at the information today, where he was speaking about the fact that Israel was going to be used to destroy tons of Arabs, and with the goal of making half the Middle East, he said, into Israel, essentially turning Israel, who's just a proxy of America, into a garrison for the United States in the Middle East region, with all of the wealth that comes along with that, the oil and so forth. For a person to go after that information today, they basically, like with a lot of other things, made it seem as if it's conspiratorial, it's spoofish. You can't even find the original source that it originated from today. But the fact that it's playing out exactly as he said it would is evidence of its authenticity and the truthfulness of it. That's exactly what we see taking place today, where you have Israel that's just killing tons of Arabs, and then you have the president coming out and saying, Netanyahu saying, we're going to have Gaza after this is all over with. But then the president comes out and says, you know what, for all of the killing that they're doing in Israel, so-called having Gaza, we're going to have Gaza. We have a plan for Gaza, is what he's saying. So we see in that all of this is really just being done for the United States of America, and Israel is functioning as its proxy in that region, as its boy to accomplish that, right? But from an article on that, the great prophet Micaiah, we're fastly running out of time. We might go a little bit over. But if you turn to the writings of the great prophet Micaiah, it's going over to the great river Euphrates. They are bound for the great river Euphrates. Their intention is to move the boundaries to the great river Euphrates. The boundaries of who? The boundaries of Israel to the great river Euphrates. If you turn over to the book of Micaiah, and I believe it's chapter 7 and verse 11. I can't get to it quickly. if you go to, let me see here. Verse 11, yes, it says, the day that your walls are to be rebuilt, that day your boundary, they are bound for the great river Euphrates, that day your boundary will be far extended, right? And then if you look over there in the side note, it tells you that it's talking about the rebuilding of the temple. You know, those two are interconnected. So we won't have an opportunity to get into a bunch of this, but here's an article that recently came out from Press TV, and it says Houthi, both religious and secular Zionists united to realize the greater Israel project, right? And he says here the leader of Yemen's Ansar Allah resistance movement says both religious and secular Zionists are united in their hostile agenda to dominate the region and realize the project of greater Israel. Speaking on Thursday, Abdul Malik al-Houthi said Israel has continued its barbaric aggression on Gaza for 19 consecutive months, committing what has become known as the crime of the century, a genocide unfolding in the heart of Islamic lands before the entire world. You know, it's the whole conversation we don't have time to get into too, but it is definitely a war of religion. And he's acknowledging that there. The one that I wanted to get to is he said both the religious and secular Zionists are united in their efforts to destroy Allah's Hamas and build the so-called temple. So here in this whole greater Israel project to expand and to extend the borders of Israel from the river to the sea, which is the Euphrates, all the way back to the very beginning of humanity in Africa, in the Nile Valley region. All of this is tied into the rebuilding of the third temple, just like we see here in this scripture where it says, in the days that your walls will be rebuilt, speaking about that temple, your boundaries will also be far extended. Both will be in operation together, just as he acknowledges in this article. Of course, they're not going to destroy Allah's Hamas. That's another conversation. The great prophet Yeketcha gets into that one, and he shows that what we're going to see there is similar to what they've done in other places where they have, religious buildings established side by side, after the example that was given to him by the great prophet Israel and his work on the rebuilding of the temple. But okay, so all of that for what's taking place with regard to Israel, and specifically this prophecy about the destruction of Iran and why it will be necessary. Why is Iran, why is Iran going to be destroyed? Remember everything that we just read here with regard to the intent to expand the borders over to Euphrates to realize the greater Israel project. And here's why Iran will have to be destroyed. And in so doing, when it takes place, it will validate the words of the great prophet years later. But nonetheless, that's the power of Yahweh. Nobody can say it's guesswork years before it ever took place. But it says Iran opposes any change in international borders. That's this article. Iran is going to be destroyed during the same time period where there's an effort to extend the boundaries. Kissinger said, the United States is moving to reshape and to mold the Middle East such that half of the Middle East is Israel. They're going to have to kill tons of Arabs in order to get it done. During that same time period, the great prophet Yeremiah says that Iran is going to be destroyed. Iran is going to be destroyed. Iran is going to be destroyed. Why? Iran opposes any changes to international borders. This whole objective and agenda that people have to reshape the region and to move boundaries, Iran opposes any changes in international borders. Right? It says here, Tehran on May 21st, the defense minister termed preserving territorial integrity and stability of regional borders, not just theirs, regional borders, among the unchangeable principles of Iran's policy. So that's what we have moving and in motion today. And it's all of what's going to lead to the destruction of Iran because they're dealing with people who are warmongers and they don't mind killing in order to achieve their objectives. And not just Iran, as we didn't have an opportunity to get into it, but as is shown here in Revelation chapter 9, is actually going to be a third part of the people over that area, the area of the Euphrates, the Tigris and Euphrates region, and what the scriptures also calls that fourth part of the earth. Speaking about the earth being divided into quadrants, so that northeast quadrant, that fourth part, that northeast quadrant of the earth, where it is found, the great river Euphrates, right? Because of the plans that are in motion by, and these once again running out front. We don't know everything that's taking place behind the scenes and who else is on board with it. We know Britain is, but who's along with one of the messengers of the four, one of the horns, one of the craftsmen, which is the United States of America, to reshape the order of the world, starting first with that area, confined first in that area, of the Euphrates, to bring forth their intentions to create a new Middle East, wherein Israel is there. They're been integrated into CENTCOM now, which is America's military unit. With Israel being there as the strongest nation, being their garrison in that region. And so all of that for the writings of the great prophet Yeremiah, which we see in motion even today, rejected during this time period and ultimately killed and not accepted and embraced as being a teacher of Yahweh. But the fact that his prophecies are being born true, lived out now in front of everybody to see, as evidence of the fact that even though he was rejected, he was definitely a teacher sent by Father Yahweh. And so we will get more into these things come next episode. Would I like to have covered more, but that'll have to do for now. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Have a great week. And join us next time for more Seeds of the Witness.